Good evening and welcome everybody. I am Gordon Gladstone, for those of you who I've not had a chance to meet. And I'm joined by Michael, and you're going to correct my pronunciation, Koplow?
Koplow.
Koplow, okay, fantastic. Of the Israel Policy Forum. Michael is the Chief Policy Officer and also serves as the Senior Research Fellow of the Kogod Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And before coming to the Israel Policy Forum, he was the founding program director of the Israel Institute and holds a PhD from Georgetown University. The Israel Policy Forum is an organization that works to shape discourse and mobilize support among American Jewish leaders and policymakers for the realization of a viable two-state solution. And they do this by educating political and communal leaders on pragmatic policy ideas developed by credible security experts. Michael, we are delighted to have you with us this afternoon, this evening, whatever this liminal moment in the day is called, twilight. And I wanted to start off by first recapping the elections we just had. Israel was starting to entertain a reputation for being like Italy in the 90s. You don't like this government? Wait 3 days, it'll change. And we went through a cycle of 4 or 5 elections in quick succession, which were basically deadlocked, right? The results almost seemed foregone that, there would be rough parity between the right of center and the left of center blocks. And the result would either be an incredibly unstable government or no government at all. And suddenly this election, and we have almost a completely different result. So I wonder if you take a moment and sort of unpack, first off, like what was that result? And then we can sort of dig into what was different about it and why it was different.
Great. So first of all, thank you for having me tonight. Always a pleasure to talk to groups about what's going on in Israel. So this was the 5th election in this cycle that really started in April 2019. So 5 elections in the span of about 3.5 years. The first 2 of those elections were completely inconclusive. The 3rd election appeared to be conclusive for a short period of time when Benny Gantz agreed to join Benjamin Netanyahu and form a unity government. But that fell apart after less than a year. And then you had election number 4, which also appeared to be decisive. That is when the anti-Netanyahu bloc was able to form a government that was referred to in Israel as the government of change. And that was the situation in which Naftali Bennett became prime minister in a prime ministerial rotation with Yair Lapid. That government lasted just over a year before it fell apart and new elections were called, largely because of defections from the coalition within Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, at which point he resigned, Yair Lapid became prime minister, and Yair Lapid remained prime minister through the elections, and actually still is prime minister today because a new government has not yet been formed. But then we had election number 5. And as you rightly point out, across all 5 elections, you had effectively a deadlock. In some of these, no government was formed. In some, you had these short-lived governments that were formed but weren't able to sustain themselves. And the polls in this election ahead of time showed that there was likely to, again, be a deadlock between the Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or that maybe the Netanyahu bloc would have a 1-seat advantage. But it looked like things were pretty evenly matched. And just as a refresher for people, when we talk about these 2 blocs, some people, for shorthand, will talk about the right-wing bloc and the left-wing bloc. That really is no longer true in Israel. There is a right-wing bloc, and that right-wing bloc is the Netanyahu bloc. It's comprised of the Likud party headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. It's comprised of the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and UTJ. Shas is the ultra-Orthodox party representing Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox Israelis, and UTJ is the party representing Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox Israelis. And then you have a number of smaller parties that ran together under the banner of religious Zionism, 3 parties that ran as a technical bloc, And these parties represent either the traditional settler and national religious right wing, or they represent some of the even farther right elements within Israel. One of these parties, I'm sure we'll discuss a lot more, Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Strength, is headed by Itamar Ben-Gvir, and that's really a party made up of successors to the outlawed Kahanist movement. There's also a small anti-LGBTQ party in there called Noam. And so, you have this Netanyahu bloc that is extremely and unwaveringly right wing, also overwhelmingly religious. The only one of those parties that is not a religious party by nature is Likud. Then on the other side, you basically have everybody else, which is why it's not quite accurate to call it a left-wing bloc. It is comprised of some left-wing parties, the traditional Israeli Jewish left, represented by Labor and Meretz. You also have the four Arab parties, Ra'am, Chadash, Ta'al, and Balad. You have a couple of centrist parties, the most prominent one being Yesh Atid, headed by Yair Lapid. You also have something that was, for this fifth election, called the National Unity Party, headed by Benny Gantz, which was really a combination of the old blue-white party and a party, Tikva Chadasha, New Hope, which is a right-wing party made up of disaffected Likud members who left Likud because they do not like Netanyahu. You have Yisrael Beitenu, which is Avigdor Lieberman's party, which is another secular right-wing party. And so you really have this mishmash of parties that span left, right, center, Jewish, and Arab, that were united by this one thing, which was they do not want to see Netanyahu as prime minister. And so those are the two blocks. And as I said, heading into the election, it was expected that these two blocks were of roughly similar strength. Now, what actually happened that made this a decisive victory for the Netanyahu bloc? So it isn't actually, as it turns out, about popular support, because if you look at these two blocks and the parties that I just mentioned, it turns out that the anti-Netanyahu bloc ended up with 30,000 votes more than the Netanyahu bloc. And so the parties in this anti-Bibi bloc actually outperformed the Bibi bloc. Nevertheless, the Bibi bloc of these it's four parties, it's really seven parties that were running together as four parties, ended up with 64 out of the 120 seats in the Knesset. So despite not having a majority of votes, they ended up with a majority of seats, and not a bare majority either. They got to 64, not 61. And so there are really two elements to this, I think. One is that the Netanyahu bloc, as I mentioned, really is a unified ideological bloc. It isn't just about supporting Netanyahu as prime minister. The parties in that bloc all share a similar ideology. They all share similar policy preferences. There are very few policy differences on that side of the political spectrum. And that enables their voters to come out and actually vote for something. And in fact, what we saw was that in cities where cities that tend to vote for right-wing parties, turnout was up somewhere between 3 and 5% from the fourth election to the fifth election. Now, on the other side, this anti-Netanyahu bloc, they weren't really for anything. They were against something. They were against Netanyahu being prime minister, but they had all sorts of disagreements about policies. And in fact, one of the misnomers, I think, is this idea that had the anti-Netanyahu bloc gotten to 61 seats, they would have formed a government. That was actually very unlikely, because that bloc is not actually a bloc in favor of one person as prime minister. There's all sorts of disagreements about who should have been prime minister. At least, as it turned out, at least 5 of the seats in that quote unquote bloc belong to Arab parties that likely would not have joined the government or supported somebody for prime minister. And so you had one bloc that was running to form a government, and you had another bloc that was running effectively to continue the cycle and go to a 6th election. And as I said, in cities that tend to vote right, turnout was up. And in cities that tend to vote for left or center, turnout was actually flat from election number 4. So that's number one. Reason number 2, and this is really what was decisive here, the Netanyahu bloc did a much better job ahead of the election of organizing. And that manifested itself in 2 ways. So as I mentioned before, the Netanyahu bloc was 4 parties that were running in the election, but those 4 parties are really 7. Because of the 4 that I mentioned, Likud, Shas, UTJ, and Religious Zionism, Likud and Shas are the only ones that are standalone parties. UTJ is actually comprised of 2 parties, Degel HaTorah, yes, Degel HaTorah and Agudat Yisrael. And Religious Zionism is comprised of 3 parties, Religious Zionism, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam. Now, it was important that these parties combine into these technical blocks because the Knesset threshold is 3.25%. Any party that does not get 3.25% of the Knesset vote, doesn't matter how many votes they get, those votes get thrown in the trash. They don't get counted. And so when you have parties such as Degel HaTorah and Agudat Yisrael that are both polling at or near the threshold, it's important for them to combine into one block as UTJ. When you have parties like Religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit and Noam, similarly, it's important for them to combine. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's not Prime Minister yet, former and soon to be Prime Minister Netanyahu, worked very hard to make sure that these parties merged. And that was particularly the case with Religious Zionism, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam. And so going into the election, there was no question that these technical blocks were all going to be well above the 3.25% threshold, and none of their votes would be wasted. The other thing they did, and this is a little more in the weeds, was sign vote sharing agreements. Didn't turn out to matter, but had this been a 60-60 election, actually it might have mattered, whereby once you get 3.25%, depending on the election, equals about 150,000 or 160,000 votes, which then means that you need another 35,000 or 40,000 seats to get, or 40,000 votes to get to another seat. And so these vote surplus agreements allow parties to combine those surplus votes so that they can actually get another seat out of it. And on the right side, on the Netanyahu side, the parties all had vote sharing agreements. Now, on the anti-Netanyahu side, we actually saw the opposite. You had Labor and Meretz, the traditional Jewish left.
Right, and they refused to do anything jointly in the end.
Correct.
Despite the fact that they were both right on that threshold.
Exactly.
And there was a lot of sort of hand-wringing, as I recall, around Yair Lapid's party possibly pulling votes out of those, parties as well.
Correct. There was concern that Yair Lapid, as head of the Yesh Atid party, the biggest party in that bloc, was cannibalizing votes from some of the smaller parties. And as a result, both Labor and Meretz were very close to the threshold. And Yair Lapid tried to get them to merge, and Meretz wanted to merge, but Labor, or I should say the Labor head, Merav Michaeli, did not. They ended up not merging. And Labor just made the Knesset threshold. They just squeaked in. They have 4 seats, which is the fewest number of seats you can have. They are now the smallest party in the Knesset, which is kind of amazing to think about, the founding party of Israel. Which, by the way, in 2015, not so long ago, won 24 seats. So they're not that far off from doing well. They're not the 4. And Meretz missed the threshold entirely. We saw something similar with the 4 Arab parties. The 4 Arab parties in the previous 4 elections twice ran as one technical bloc called the Joint List, and twice ran as two separate parties. The combinations were actually different those 2 times. But the point is that in elections 1, 2, 3, and 4, these 4 parties ran either as 1 or as 2. In this election, they ran as 3 because Ra'am, the Islamist party that was part of the previous coalition, ran on its own, and Chadash and Ta'al ran together as the Joint List, and Balad, which had run with them previously, decided to run on its own, and Balad did not make the threshold. And so between Balad and Meretz, you had about 285,000 votes that got thrown out, weren't counted. And as a result, that's how you get to those parties in that bloc getting 30,000 votes more than the parties in the other bloc, and yet it's the other bloc that has 64 seats. And so, in a lot of ways, this really is a story about organizing and the importance of making sure that you prepare ahead of an election for what will happen afterward.
So I guess the other question that leaps to my mind is there's been a lot of talk in the last 4 cycles, but also in this cycle about turnout within the Arab sector. Right, they are 20% of the population, but they are not 20% of the parliament. They've never been part of a government, and the Bennett-Lapid government actually included, an Arab party for the first time ever, and there was much made about the space in the budget that was given to attending to things in Arab municipalities. So what, was there an electoral reward for that, or was it just was it a turnout question here, or was it just a question like these guys couldn't agree to sit in the room together and therefore they, burned all their votes?
So it's more the second, but it's not only that. The lesson of these 5 elections is that the voters, the Arab voters who vote for these Arab parties, tend to be much more excited when they run together. Now, it's important to note that these 4 parties actually don't make a lot of sense running together. They are very wildly different.
Right, right. Christian communists and
exactly.
Islamists, right? Yeah,
exactly. Precisely.
and even the communists aren't really communists.
right. You have a communist party, a very conservative Islamist party, 2 Arab nationalist parties, one of which sort of accepts Israel's right to exist, the other which really doesn't. Very odd pairings, but Arab voters tend to be more excited when they run together. And when they ran together in the first election, they got 13 seats. And in the third election, which was their high water mark, they got 15 seats. Whereas when they run separately, they do much worse. Now, in the fourth election, they were separated into 2 groups. Ram, the Islamist party, ran independently, and that was the party that joined the coalition. Now, there was a lot of evidence ahead of the 5th election that there was discontent among Arab voters with Ram, because Ram joined the coalition with a promise of improving things in the Arab sector in Israel. And it did indeed get a lot more money for budgets for Arab municipalities. But the things that Arab voters are concerned about, aren't just budgets, it's changes on the ground. And, things like crime in their cities, things like housing, things like making sure that Bedouin communities in the South are hooked up to water and electricity. Budgets are easy, right? You pass a budget and you say you guys are going to get a lot of money over the next 4 years, but these changes take a long time to wind their way through the system. And so a lot of Arab voters said, okay, we're getting these budgets, but you haven't addressed crime yet. You haven't addressed housing yet. And so, the previous government that lasted really only a year didn't get quite the full opportunity to actually institute the changes that Arab voters wanted. And there was also a lot of discontent among Arab voters, particularly the Islamist conservative voters who vote for Ram, over Israeli policies on the Temple Mount. We've seen this steady erosion over the past few years of the historic status quo on the Temple Mount, which, the shorthand for the status quo is Muslims pray, non-Muslims visit. And there has been not only more frequent and high-profile Jewish visits to the Temple Mount, there have been many instances of Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, to the point where you now have daily prayer on the Temple Mount that the Israeli police kind of turn a blind eye to. And so there's this narrative within the conservative and religious Arab sector in Israel that Al-Aqsa is under assault and Al-Aqsa is under threat. And so considering that you had this religious Islamist party in the government, or I should say in the coalition, and they weren't able to arrest the perception within Arab society that Al-Aqsa was under threat, that caused difficulties as well. Now, Ram did make the Knesset. They have 5 seats, and Hadash Ta'al, who ran together, also have 5 seats. As I mentioned, Balad did not make it. And so, this time you have 10 seats for these parties in the Knesset, down from 15 in the last one. Had Balad run with Hadash Ta'al, evidence suggests they would have gotten another seat, maybe another 2 seats, still would have been below the high water mark of 15. Arab turnout was up about 8% from the 4th election, but that's still down almost 10% from the 3rd election. So, we see this, we saw a bit more enthusiasm, and I think it was probably driven more by the threat that Arab voters saw coming from the right. But, the evidence suggests that Arab voters are much happier when these 4 parties run as one bloc.
Okay. And then on the right-hand side, so, one of the things that you sort of at a math level is sort of an interesting question is, right, we all know the natural increase in the ultra-Orthodox community exceeds that of pretty much every other sector except the Arabs. And yet the ultra-Orthodox, representation of the Knesset has been pretty much static since the 90s. And, there has been some supposition that the younger Haredim, the younger ultra-Orthodox voters, are actually voting for these more right-wing nationalist parties as opposed to the traditional parties of their, rabbinical, the rabbinical courts. And is that something that, is actually panning out in the election results that you can see?
It is. So UTJ was static between election number 4 and election number 5. Shas improved by a couple of seats. But the evidence is really that Shas did better because they focused a lot on inflation and quality of life. Shas is an ultra-Orthodox party, but they also have a traditional base of non-ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi voters.
Right, sort of a populist.
Exactly. And so, they ran a very economic populist campaign and seems to have paid off. Now, there is a trend within ultra-Orthodox society in Israel of the ultra-Orthodox over the past decade becoming more nationalist. Historically, the ultra-Orthodox are, I wouldn't say anti-Zionist, but they're non-Zionists. They effectively
agnostic.
Exactly. They're Zionist agnostic. They participate in politics because they understand that to not do so means that their sector will lose out on benefits and subsidies and things that are and budgets, things that are important to their lives. But they aren't traditionally nationalists. They traditionally don't place a lot of emphasis on, for instance, Eretz Yisrael Hashleimah, Greater Land of Israel. They don't place a lot of emphasis on the settlement movement. The two largest Jewish cities in the West Bank are both ultra-Orthodox cities, Modi'in, Beitar Elite, but they're both right on the green line. They're there because it's cheaper. They're there for quality of life, not because they have some sort of ideological attachment to the West Bank. Now, what we've been seeing over the past 10 years is that this is starting to shift. And you see greater ultra-Orthodox movement, especially among younger ultra-Orthodox, to a more right-wing ideology, a more nationalist ideology. Earlier this year in the spring, we had the first ultra-Orthodox illegal outpost established in the West Bank, something that had never happened before, which is unusual. We also see, if you looked at some of the rallies that were held by some of the far-right parties, such as Otzma Yehudit, there were lots of younger ultra-Orthodox faces in those rallies. We've seen ultra-Orthodox in May 2021, for instance, lots of ultra-Orthodox clashing in the streets of Jerusalem with Palestinians, not necessarily in Sheikh Jarrah, which you'd expect them to be there because that's where the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik is, Simon the Just, but seeing them clash with Palestinians outside the walls of the old city around Damascus Gate, in more nationalist clashes. And so, it's hard to say for sure, but the numbers seem to suggest that one or two of the seats, of the 14 seats, won by the religious Zionism bloc, were on the backs of ultra-Orthodox voters. And that is a huge shift. And if that trend continues, then we're going to see a fusion of two very quick growing demographic groups on the Jewish side, ultra-Orthodox and the more national religious settler community, whose ideology is sort of fusing. And you see the ultra-Orthodox becoming more nationalist, and you see the national religious becoming more right-wing in kind of an ultra-nationalist conservative way, not just about issues regarding settlement, but issues sort of regarding more populist nationalism. And
right.
So
yeah. I mean, we used to use the term Chazalnikim. Right. It was sort of like it was sort of a mashup of Haredi and Dati Leumi, right? The national religious sort of coming together. And it was a knitted kippah with really long peyot. It was sort of the shorthand look.
Precisely. And someone like Bezalel Smotrich, who's the head of religious Zionism, really embodies this Chardal movement. You look at the person who used to head what was effectively the predecessor party to religious Zionism, Jewish Home, that was Naftali Bennett, who lived in Renana, not a settlement, or where he needed to kippah, but it's about the size of a silver dollar.
Right.
And was seen as a more moderate, more outward-looking person. Now we have Bezalel Smotrich, who really is more in this Chardal ideology.
Right. So let's shift a little bit to, all right, there's a new coalition emerging. Aside from Bibi Netanyahu, who are the power players in this? They're the people who make the headlines and the people who are probably behind the scenes really moving things around.
Right.
So who are these guys? And they're almost all guys.
So yes, they are. They are actually this time around all guys. So we have Bibi Netanyahu, well known to everybody. He is, going to be the prime minister. The next person that's important to know, and I've mentioned him now a couple of times, is Bezalel Smotrich. Bezalel Smotrich is the head of religious Zionism. He controls 7 seats in the Knesset now that religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit have split up for the Knesset purposes. He controls 7 seats, but he is a very savvy operator. He has experience as a minister. He served previously as transportation minister. He is extremely ideological, and he is likely to be finance minister. And one of the things that he has demanded as finance minister is to also have the power that the defense ministry now has over settlements transferred over to the finance ministry. And one of the things that he is demanding is that the civil administration, which is the defense ministry body that is in charge of basically all decisions regarding settlements and all decisions regarding Palestinians who live in Area C, which is the 60% of the West Bank that is under full and complete Israeli control. He is insisting that the civil administration be transferred to the finance ministry so that he can oversee it. This is a big deal for a couple of reasons. The first is that it will give somebody who is one of the most hardcore ideological settlers around control over settlement policy in the West Bank. Bezalel Smotrich is somebody who is on record as wanting to annex the entire West Bank without giving any of the Palestinians living there political rights. He's also on record as being in favor of setting up a new ministry in Israel that will, after annexation, that will be in charge of convincing Palestinians living in the West Bank to emigrate to other countries. Not to sugarcoat it, this is a guy who's in favor of both annexation and population transfer. It seems from the coalition negotiations that he will indeed get control of the civil administration and be in charge of settlement policy in the West Bank. That's going to mean steps to legalize illegal outposts. And when I say illegal outposts, I mean outposts that are illegal under Israeli law. There are about 205 of these outposts in the West Bank on top of the 127 legal settlements, and again, legal meaning under Israeli law. And one of the first things that he has said he wants to do is to legalize those some 205 outposts and farms. He's also in favor of applying full Israeli civil law to settlements inside the West Bank, and then finally moving toward annexation. And so I think that all of these things are going to start to be put in motion. How far they go is yet to be determined, but they're all going to be put into motion. The other reason that this is significant, aside from just what it will mean on the ground, is that since 1967, Israel has been very careful to keep all issues pertaining to the West Bank under the auspices of the defense ministry, because the Israeli government has not annexed the West Bank, and they, depending on which institution you're talking about, the official position of the government is that the West Bank is disputed territory. The position of the Supreme Court is that it's occupied territory, but everybody agrees that it is not formally part of Israel. And that is why control of the West Bank has always been in the defense ministry. Moving it into the finance ministry, which is obviously a civilian ministry, is an enormous step, even if you aren't formally annexing the territory. It really fundamentally changes its status. And I think that that's going to have a lot of implications down the road for Israel in terms of the international legal community and in terms of how people think about Israel's military occupation and to what extent it's a temporary military occupation and to what extent it's permanent.
Right. I mean, that moves it from a arguable violation of the Geneva Convention to a clear violation of the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The next person who's important to know in this government is Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the head of Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Strength. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir is somebody who, when he was 18, was barred from IDF service by the IDF because he was considered to be too radical of an extremist. He has 7 convictions on his record, one of which is for support of a terrorist organization and incitement to racist violence. Itamar Ben-Gvir has struck a deal with Prime Minister Netanyahu to become the National Security Minister. That is actually a new ministry. It is an expanded version of what is now called the Public Security Ministry. The Public Security Ministry oversees the police and internal security inside of Israel. It's being renamed the National Security Ministry and given additional powers under Itamar Ben-Gvir, including power over the West Bank border police, who have traditionally been under the auspices of the Defense Ministry because they operate in the West Bank. In addition, this new National Security Ministry is going to have a lot more power over the police commissioner. Traditionally, the Public Security Minister can set overarching policy, but the police commissioner has complete discretion over operations and tactics. Some of those powers are now being shifted so that the National Security Minister will have more say over things like where police get deployed, for instance. And Itamar Ben-Gvir is going to be the guy who is in charge of this. He's also going to be the person, given that he's in charge of the police, who will effectively be in charge of policing on the Temple Mount. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir, aside from his history of criminal convictions, also has some real history with the police. In May 2021, when you had rockets fired on Jerusalem, and then you had Israel's Operation Guardian of the Walls in Gaza, and you had riots in mixed Israeli cities, the police commissioner, Kobi Shabtai, who was still in that position, publicly blamed Itamar Ben-Gvir for instigating the violence because he would go and turn out in these flashpoints in force and would spark riots. He did so in Sheikh Jarrah, which was a big flashpoint in Jerusalem. He's also someone who wants to relax the restrictions for Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. Has openly talked about building prayer spaces for Jews on the Temple Mount. Whether you agree with that in principle or not, the Temple Mount is generally the most sensitive spot when it comes to violence between Israelis and Palestinians, which is why the status quo is something that no government, including very right-wing governments, have really messed around with in the past. It's now going to be Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is nominally in charge of arrangements on the Temple Mount, and who is also in charge of the police. And so, he's somebody who has been in the news a lot, given his views and his past history. I think he's going to be in the news a lot more. Another important person to know is Aryeh Deri. Aryeh Deri is the head of Shas. He is possibly the most experienced politician inside of Israel, aside from Netanyahu. He has been around since the 90s. He's served as interior minister and a bunch of other positions. He is a very savvy operator. He is seen in the context of this coalition as actually being probably the most moderate voice. He's not somebody who is reputed to have right of center views on the West Bank or on Israeli-Palestinian issues. He's moved over time, given that his voter base has also become more right-wing. But he's somebody who's now seen as sort of the responsible party. He's also somebody who is controversial because he has a history of being convicted for corruption and for tax evasion.
Right, he's got two convictions, and he also sat in Yitzhak Rabin's government that signed the Oslo Accords.
Yes, he did. And one of the things that is happening before this new government is formed is that the Knesset that is now controlled by the Netanyahu bloc, even before government is formed. The Knesset is going to pass legislation. Right now, if you've been convicted of an offense that is considered one of moral turpitude, which Aryeh Deri has, you are not allowed to serve as a minister. Now, Aryeh Deri was convicted of tax evasion and had to resign from the previous government, but because of a plea bargain, he got a suspended sentence. And so this Knesset is about to pass a law that's going to change the moral turpitude clause to saying that you're only barred from serving as a minister if you served jail time, not if you were convicted of the crime, which will then allow Aryeh Deri to become interior minister, which will allow this government to be formed. That's actually a step that's going to happen before the formation of a government. The last person I'll mention is Yariv Levin. Yariv Levin is the person who actually came in first in the Likud primary. He is probably Netanyahu's closest confidant within Likud. He's the person who heads Netanyahu's coalition negotiations, both now and in previous attempts. He is likely going to be appointed justice minister. There's a good chance he's actually going to be appointed Knesset speaker first on a temporary basis, but then probably he will be justice minister. And this is important because the thing that is most important for not only Netanyahu, but the parties on the right is what they call justice reform. And that means different things to different people. For Netanyahu, justice reform means doing something to get rid of his current trial. He's currently on trial on three separate counts, and he would like to get rid of those trials. For the other people within the right-wing bloc, and that includes the party, judicial reform means limiting the oversight powers of Israel's Supreme Court. There's a long-held perception on the Israeli right that the Supreme Court is controlled by the left and that it frequently thwarts right-wing legislation. And there's also a complaint on the Israeli right that the Supreme Court really is not a democratically accountable body because the people of Israel are not the Knesset, but the Supreme Court is appointed. And the way it's appointed, I'm happy to go into this in more depth, but the way it's appointed also means that Supreme Court justice appointments are determined by sitting Supreme Court justices and members of the Bar Association. And so, the complaint on the Israeli right is that we have this democratic body in the Knesset, and it's really held hostage by a non-democratic body in the Supreme Court. And so something that the Israeli right has wanted to do for a long time is pass legislation that allows the Knesset to override Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority of 61 Knesset members. And Yariv Levin is somebody who has been at the forefront of this judicial reform movement. He's talked very openly about wanting to limit the Supreme Court's power, talked very openly about wanting to change the way judges are appointed, talked very openly about wanting to limit the authority of the Attorney General, talked very openly about wanting to make it so that legal advisors in ministries are not civil servants, but are political appointees selected by the ministers themselves. And so as justice minister, he is going to oversee all of these things. And I think, it's pretty clear so far that this catch-all category of justice reform is going to be the first thing on the agenda of the new government. And so we're going to see that, I think, wind its way through the system pretty quickly as well. So
I guess one might wonder, okay, so there are potentially some flies in the ointment. They have a fantasy list. I guess looking at the foreign policy piece first, right? So, obviously disturbing the status quo in the Temple Mount is going to, lead to some friction with, everybody who is a party to the Abraham Accords, plus, the Jordanian and Egyptian peace treaties, plus, Hezbollah sitting up there, in the northern Galil, how far do you think they will go with some of these things before they bump into these reality constraints?
The Temple Mount, as I previously noted, is the most sensitive spot in all of this. It's possibly the most sensitive spot in the entire world, and it's also a place where Netanyahu has been burned a number of times in the past. When he was his very first term as prime minister in the 90s, he authorized excavation of tunnels under the Western Wall.
Right, in 96, right?
96, yeah. Yep. Which led to riots and all sorts of violence, and actually led Netanyahu to then sign an accord with the Palestinian Authority, turning over parts of Hebron.
Right, the Wye River Accords.
Right, to the PA. In 2017, people might remember there were 3 Israeli police who were shot right outside the entrance to the Temple Mount, and Netanyahu then erected metal detectors at the 9 entrances used by Muslims for the Temple Mount. That also sparked a huge backlash, and immediately the metal detectors were removed. And then in 2021, when we had this fighting between Israel and Hamas and the riots inside of mixed cities in Israel, that was also sparked by this perception of a threat to the Temple Mount. Israeli police clashing with Muslims on the Mount and firing tear gas canisters in Al-Aqsa. So Netanyahu has been burned a number of times. And so I think that if there's one spot where he's likely to try to exercise caution and really restrain his coalition partners, it's probably going to be over the Temple Mount. But there's only so much he can do, because even if the status quo is not changed, it's going to be hard for him to stop someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir from visiting the Temple Mount. And even something like that, can cause a lot of damage. Not coincidentally, the Second Intifada was really kicked off following Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount in 2000. And so those types of things can spiral out of control very quickly. And you mentioned Jordan. The Abraham Accords countries are concerned about Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, and they will certainly be pressing the Israeli government to tiptoe very carefully. But the relationship that is most at risk, I think, with this new government is the relationship between Israel and Jordan, and particularly given anything on the Temple Mount, because the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty of 1994 acknowledges Jordan's special role on the Temple Mount. The Waqf, which is the Muslim body charged with overseeing the Al-Aqsa complex, is controlled by Jordan, and so any changes with regard to the Temple Mount, any friction with regard to the Temple Mount, really causes lots of problems for the Israeli-Jordanian relationship, and I think that that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Right. And the Hashemites themselves, are constrained domestically in Jordan, by their situation, right? They're constantly pressed by, their right flank, as it were, the more conservative Muslim sectors of their society, to be more robust on those issues.
Right. So, the largest party in the Jordanian parliament is the Islamist party in Jordan, Jordan's offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, they are constantly pressing, certainly on Temple Mount issues, but on the issue of Israel more generally. The Jordanian parliament has now voted multiple times to abrogate the peace treaty with Israel. And the other problem that the Hashemite monarchy has is that Jordan is about 60% Palestinian. And traditionally, the monarchy is supported by the Bedouin tribes in Jordan. They have a lot more trouble with the Palestinian population. And of course, any issues with regard to Jerusalem or the West Bank tend to inflame Jordan's Palestinian population, or I should say their population of Palestinian descent. And so, these are all super sensitive issues for Jordan, not just in terms of how they relate to Israel, but in terms of the monarchy's own domestic political situation.
Right. And the Palestinians are like largely the entire merchant class of
Correct.
Jordan. I mean, I remember being in Amman, and every shop you went into, every taxi cab you got into, every restaurant you went to, it was Palestinian owned and operated.
Right.
And if you were traveling with Palestinians, it was great because there was a built-in discount. But like if you wanted to actually meet a Bedouin, a Hashemite Bedouin, you had to basically get out of town,
Right.
or go to the royal palace. Those are your choices.
Yeah. Right. And then, the other issue with Israel's foreign relations, moving on from Jerusalem and just thinking a little bit about what may happen in the West Bank, the Abraham Accord states have tried very hard to wall off their bilateral relationship with Israel from the Palestinian issue. And while the Abraham Accords really came about because of the annexation crisis, where the UAE publicly said to Israel, you can have normalization with us or you can have annexation, but you can't have both. And the Israeli public overwhelmingly was supportive of normalized relations with the UAE. We're far enough down the road, and the relationship between Israel and the UAE in particular is robust enough that I'm not sure at this point there's anything that will reverse the Abraham Accords. You can see a scenario in which the Emirati ambassador is recalled or relations are temporarily downgraded. But I don't think that the Abraham Accord states, given their interests, the UAE now has billions of dollars at stake in terms of trade with Israel. And Bahrain is the only Arab country that actually has an Israeli defense attaché stationed there permanently. They really rely on Israel for the security relationship. Those relationships are important to them. And so, I don't think that they're going to let the situation in the West Bank completely dictate their relationships with Israel. That being said, if things move very quickly in the West Bank and you have outposts legalized and you have sovereignty applied to settlements and you have portions of the West Bank annexed and you have greater unrest and violence in the West Bank between the IDF and Palestinians, it's going to be hard for UAE and Bahrain, and all the more so Morocco, to continue business as usual. And so I don't think that these relationships are going to be rolled back. But I do think that they may be subject to some kind of downgrade or even temporary suspension.
Right, and all of that is then pivoted against sort of the anti-Iran alliance, right? Because that's de facto what's happening. We have Sunni states and the Israelis agreeing that they all, fear Iran's encroachment into their spheres of influence.
Correct. Although the Iranians are not, it's not that they're not as big a deal, but the Sunni approach to the Iranians is very different from the Israeli approach. Because while the Sunni states are concerned about Iran in the region, they're concerned about, what's referred to as the Shia Crescent. They're concerned about Iranian terrorism. They don't have the same fear of Iran's nuclear program that Israel does. I think that there's an idea that Israel and the Sunni states have been aligned sort of in lockstep against the Obama administration, the Biden administration, in terms of their positioning on the JCPOA. I'm not sure that's entirely the case. The UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, they actually are not anti-JCPOA. They'd sort of like to see the nuclear issue put to bed. They're much more concerned about Iran's other activities, whereas for the Israelis, the nuclear issue is first, second, and last, right?
Right.
So I think there is some distinction between them, but there's no question that the Israel, the Abraham Accord states, and states that are not parties to the Abraham Accord, such as Saudi Arabia, generally want to blunt Iran's influence in the region. And it's another reason why sort of the logic of the Abraham Accords, isn't going to be entirely susceptible to events in the West Bank. I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention the United States. Here there is bound to be a lot more friction between the U.S. and Israel over West Bank issues. The issue that has been the source of the most tension over the past decade, Iran, actually at this point is much reduced, given that the JCPOA at this point is a dead letter, not just because of the state of negotiations, but because of the protests inside of Iran. Right. So at this point, the U.S. and Israel are not really arguing about any sort of Iran deal. But we are going to see, and we've already seen, U.S. concerns about some of the new figures in the prospective Israeli government. We've seen State Department statements about Itamar Ben-Gvir specifically. There have been reports about the U.S. Behind the scenes warning about what happens if Bezalel Smotrich is appointed defense minister, something that Smotrich was angling for a couple of weeks ago. And I think we're certainly going to see a lot of friction if we see the status of the West Bank changed in any way. The Biden administration does not want to get bogged down in Israeli-Palestinian issues. They don't see any peace accord on the horizon. They're not interested in trying to get the two sides together, but they are very much interested in preserving conditions for a future two-state outcome. And so anything that makes that less likely, and many of the moves that are being contemplated by the prospective new government are going to make that indeed less likely, if not impossible, are going to cause a lot of tension with the Biden administration. And it remains to be seen how that will manifest itself. I don't see it manifesting itself in things like conditioning security assistance to Israel, but I do think that lots of open diplomatic friction. Perhaps the U.S. Being a bit more loose with the types of resolutions that come through the Security Council. I think all of those things may be on the table depending on how far the Israeli government goes.
Right. So I guess then that brings us to the question of, and there's been a fair bit of ink spilled on this. I was looking at Haaretz today, and I think, half the columns today were about the question of the relationship between diaspora Jews, particularly American Jews, and this new Israeli government. And one of the commentators basically said, Israel to American Jews. Thanks, it was fun, but we're done. And then what does that mean, for American politics, given that American Jews vote at a rate of about 75% or so for Democrats consistently, much to the consternation of many people, including Sheldon Adelson. So I'm curious to sort of get your take on, how that starts to play out.
Distancing between Israel and American Jews, obviously, is not new. Right. We see this in poll after poll. American Jews overwhelmingly still feel a connection with Israel, but they also overwhelmingly are not supportive of the policies of most Israeli governments. There's of course been lots of consternation over things like the breakdown of the Western Wall arrangement, non-recognition of conservative and reform Judaism inside of Israel. There's now talk about amending the law of return so that in order to be eligible, it's not no longer going to be having one Jewish grandparent, but you would have to be Jewish through matrilineal descent. Interestingly, Avigdor Lieberman, the outgoing finance minister, sent a letter today to a number of members of Congress and American Jewish organizations, asking them to effectively pressure the new Israeli government not to amend the law of return. Interesting for a number of reasons, starting with the fact that Avigdor Lieberman has been one of the few Israeli political figures over time who has had very little interest in dealing with North American Jews. Also somebody who generally has not been seen as a figure who wants to invite outside pressure on Israel, but he wrote in public letter today calling for international pressure on Israel.
Yeah, although it does make sense given that his constituency largely consists of people who are not matrilineal Jews.
Correct.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, like it's the Nuremberg Standard, right? The law of return is basically said, if Hitler would have killed you, you can claim citizenship. Right. We may not recognize you as a Jew, but you can claim citizenship.
Right. No, not surprising. Not surprising that he takes this policy position.
Right.
The tactics are surprising, given
right.
Given he's at.
Oh yeah, no, he was laughable as he was the minister for diaspora affairs for a hot minute.
Yeah, he may have been, but even as foreign minister, he had no.
Yeah, I mean, and he was just sort of like, whatever,
and so obviously we've seen these issues percolating for a long time. This is only going to worsen it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's not just that 75% of American Jews vote for Democrats. A similar number are opposed to Israeli policy in the West Bank. And that's a policy that it's about to, I think, become a lot more egregious in the minds of American Jews. Even things like birthright. Birthright announced this week, due to a reduction in donations from the Adelson family, that they're going to be cutting the number of trips they do by a third. This is something that is traditionally bound. I shouldn't say traditionally because birthright's only been around for a couple of decades, but for the past couple of decades, has really bound many American Jews to Israel. That's looks like it's now going to get reduced, and so we're seeing on all these fronts ways in which the friction that already exists between American Jews and Israel, I think about to get worsened. And I think it's a scary thing for American Jewish identity, because for better or for worse, American Jewish identity, really since the establishment of the State of Israel, has in many ways been premised on Zionism and a connection to Israel. And I think that if that connection gets weakened, or even for many American Jews severed, it's not only going to be a question of how they relate to Israel and how they relate to Zionism. I think there's going to be a real question about what American Jewish identity means. And there's going to have to be, a lot more thinking about what does American Jewish identity consist of if we're no longer taking for granted this connection to Israel and viewing Israel not just as a theoretical Jewish homeland, but as an actual real place to which American Jews feel a connection. So, to me, in many ways, while as the chief policy officer of a policy organization, that deals with Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm obviously extremely worried about many of the things that may be coming in terms of the West Bank and Gaza and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But as an American Jew, in some ways, I think the bigger crisis that we may need to be keeping an eye on is American Jewish identity, and what this even greater distancing is going to do to American Jewish practice and American Jewish identity. One thing I want to say is that this new government is obviously difficult for a lot of people, and it's going to be natural to kind of wash our hands of it, not just of the government, but say Israel no longer looks like a place that we recognize and is not a place we want to identify with. And I think it's important to push back on that instinct that many people will have. We're living in a time where we actually have a Jewish state and Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish homeland. for many of us, this seems like a natural thing. I'm 43 years old, right? My entire life has been spent with a state of Israel, and we're now getting to the point where Israel is about to be 75, where the majority of American Jews who are alive have that exact same experience. But it's important to recognize in the scope of history that is an incredible anomaly. It's literally a blip in the scope of Jewish history, and the fact that we are privileged to actually be living in a time where it exists, I think means we should all be thinking really hard about what that means and how we can work to make the situation better, not to disengage from it, not to wash our hands of it, not to say this is not something that's important to us, to acknowledge the importance and to recognize what an incredible time this is in Jewish history, and to think about how we want that relationship to look like, as opposed to saying we don't want to have that relationship at all, because I think to discard it really would be in many ways tragic.
Right. And I think, to sort of go a step further, there is only one parallel for the moment we're in historically, where there has been, a really rich, vibrant, relatively secure diaspora community and Jewish sovereignty. And that was during the reign of Herod the Great and the community of Alexandria. And, we know, courtesy of Josephus, a whole lot about Herod the Great. We know almost nothing about the community of Alexandria and how they felt about Herod the Great, or any of his descendants, or any of the machinations that were going on in the Roman Empire at that time. So this is really uncharted territory to a great degree, especially for those of us on the diaspora side. I don't know that Bibi looks at Herod the Great and thinks, "Ooh, that's a good role model," but maybe he does. So, but I mean, it is a really anomalous moment in Jewish history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one brief word, because you had asked also about how it will impact politics here in the United States. American policymakers, whether it's always evident or not, really do take their cues on Israeli-Palestinian issues from the American Jewish community. They pay attention to what we say. They pay attention to how we're communicating that, through not just the organizations we support, but through American Jewish institutions. And I think that it'll be important, if we want to see U.S. policy have an impact on what's going on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians and with the new Israeli government. It'll be important for us to communicate our views to our elected leaders and to really. I'm tempted to say to present a unified front, but the joke about two Jews, three synagogues, always applies. I'm not sure we can have a unified front on anything. But to the greatest extent possible, I think this is going to be an important time for American Jewish unity and to really have as large a segment of American Jewry as possible consistent in terms of what we want to see from the U.S. government and how we want to see the U.S. government engage with the Israeli government.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, this has been an edifying hour. So I appreciate you taking the time late in the night, your time, to be with us. People who are interested in learning more can go, the website is ipf.org. Am I getting that right?
IsraelPolicyForum.org.
IsraelPolicyForum.org. I do know that J Street is having their national conference coming up in a couple of weeks. And there is a virtual option.
It's actually this upcoming weekend.
Yeah, next week. And there is a virtual option if people are interested in tuning in for that, among other opportunities to get smarter. Because I know they'll have, I think Anthony Blinken is speaking at the conference this year. But I want to thank you, Michael, for joining us. I want to give a shout out to Max for helping to put this together, and Zach on our tech team. And thank everybody for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you at upcoming events. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope everybody enjoys their evening.
All right. Good night, all.